JavaScript hasn't always been the way it is today. There was a time in which there were no classes, no constant-let keywords, no arrow functions, no async await, and so on. You're watching Andy Coding Stuff, and this is Ancient JavaScript, a series in which we will take a look at how we did our jobs when all these features didn't yet exist. Today, we're going to talk about how variables worked before constant-let. In 2015, a new version of JavaScript called ECMAScript 2015, or ES6, was released. It was a massive milestone that brought many changes. One of the most important ones was how variables worked. Today, we use constant-let most of the time. Just to refresh our minds, both of them work exactly in the same way. The only difference is that const doesn't allow to change the assigned value, while let does. However, before these two existed, we used the var keyword to define variables. So what's the difference? What else can change apart from being able to reassign the value? Well, it all comes down to the scope of the declared variables. When you declare something with const or let, the variable will have block scope. This means that it will exist only inside the block in which it was declared. So what's a block? A block is any piece of code delimited with curly braces. In this snippet, for example, this is a block because it's delimited with curly braces. Or here, this is also a block because, again, it's delimited with curly braces. Even this is a block despite not being part of a conditional or for loop. And in this case, we have one block here and another here. Notice how the outer block includes the inner block. So, if we define a variable with const or let inside a block and try to access it outside it, we won't be able to see it. Here's another piece of code that won't work because we're trying to access it outside the block in which it was declared. Now, when you use var, the scope behaves radically different. The variables declared with var have function scope. This means that no matter where they were declared, they will be visible in the whole function. So, here, if we change let to var, the scope automatically grows until reaching the whole function. This means that this snippet will log a 3, and more surprisingly, this one will log a 10, because that's the last value the I variable took, and since it exists in the whole function, it will keep on existing after the loop ends. Even this behaves in a way you probably weren't expecting. The end variable, having function scope, exists outside the conditional despite having been declared there. So, how did this affect our code? Which were the best practices at the time related to how variables were declared? To begin with, everyone had to be aware of how scope behaved with var, as it was not similar to most of the languages of the time. Second, one of the recommended best practices was to declare all your variables at the beginning of the function in which they were used. This made explicit the real place in which they began to exist. Here's another example with a for loop. Notice how the looping variable is declared at the top of the container function. We even had a handy trick with a fancy name, immediately invoked function expression, or IFI. We used it when we wanted to enforce a limited scope. Here, we have an anonymous function that will limit the scope of the variables declared inside it. The parentheses at the end invoke the function right away so the code inside runs immediately. Finally, we used to name constants with uppercase to be aware that they were constants and avoided reassigning them. Obviously, this was an error-prone technique and depended on the developer. Nowadays, trying to reassign a constant will just not work. So, looking at all this, it was very fortunate that block scoping was introduced in ES 2015, because it simplified our code and the reasoning behind it. This doesn't end here. Before ES 2015, there were many other differences in the way we wrote JS code, but that will be for the next time. Until then, happy coding!